Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a close look at some source material offering a pretty sharp critical view of Bitcoin's current state. It asks some tough questions about where things might be headed.
Yeah, we're diving into an article by Matthew Catt titled Bitcoin's Red Light District Future, a Critical Examination. And, well, that title alone tells you it's using a pretty provocative analogy to make its case.
Exactly. So our mission here is to unpack the core argument of this article, really dig into the specific examples and claims it uses, and try to understand what it suggests about, the cultural forces and the tech decisions shaping Bitcoin's path.
And just to be clear, we're sticking strictly to what's in the source material itself.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this.
So the article jumps right in with this central comparison. It likens Bitcoin blocks getting increasingly full of what the author calls encryption spam, to places like the red light districts you might find in Thailand.
Okay, and the point of comparing it to a red light district isn't just that it's busy, right?
No, not at all. The source argues that while those districts are definitely economically active, they're not really environments for, say, truly innovative or long-term sort of virtuous development.
So bustling, but maybe not in the way you'd ideally want for growth.
That's the idea presented. The source contrasts this with somewhere like Silicon Valley. It admits Silicon Valley has its issues, the boom and bust cycles.
Sure.
But historically, it has been a place for major innovation, driven by a longer-term vision and attracting what the source calls quality tenants.
People focused on building something substantial.
Right. Participants focused on creating real, lasting value.
Okay, so how does that connect back to Bitcoin blocks specifically?
Well, the article points out that blocks are nearly full. It even gives a number like 3.96 megabytes out of a possible 4 megabytes are being used.
Pretty much at capacity then.
But the crucial argument isn't that they're full, it's who or what is filling that space. The source contends these blocks are packed with low-rent tenants.
And low-rent tenants here means...
It specifically calls out things like inscriptions and what it terms OP return spam.
Can you quickly break down what the source means by those?
Sure. So in this context, inscriptions are basically arbitrary data images, text, whatever, embedded directly onto the blockchain. And OP return is a standard feature that lets you add a tiny bit of data to a transaction.
Okay.
The source's point is, when block space is dominated by this kind of non-monetary data, that's what it calls spam, and those are the low-rent tenants.
Got it. So the big takeaway early on is just seeing full blocks on a chart doesn't automatically mean Bitcoin is, succeeding in its main mission.
Exactly. The source uses another analogy here. A landlord getting full rent because the building's full of tattoo parlors doesn't guarantee that high-class businesses are going to move in later.
Right. The current occupants set the tone for the neighborhood, so to speak.
Precisely. Full blocks of non-financial or speculative data, according to the source, aren't the same as full blocks carrying valuable monetary transfers.
And the main consequence the source points to.
It's pretty straightforward. This kind of spam allegedly takes up precious block space that could be used for actual monetary transactions, like sending BTC between people.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, because the article doesn't just diagnose the problem, right? It starts pointing fingers.
Oh, yeah. It levels some pretty sharp criticism at certain crypto VCs and groups it calls malicious mining pools.
And what's the criticism? What are they supposedly doing wrong?
The article basically accuses them of magical thinking. It suggests they see this flood of spam, the inscriptions, the BRC20s, etc., as just like a temporary phase.
A stepping stone.
Yeah, like it's just a necessary step that will somehow, almost magically, lead to real, valuable monetary use cases popping up later on.
But the source doesn't buy that.
Not at all. The counterargument is blunt. This view isn't just optimistic, it's portrayed as naive and actively harmful.
Harmful.
The article argues really strongly that once a network's neighborhood, let's say, starts to go sleazy, meaning its main use shifts away from the intended purpose towards this lower value stuff, it becomes incredibly hard to reverse that.
Why?
It points to something called path dependency. The idea that the choices you make now, the character the network takes on today, makes it much more likely it'll just keep going down that same path. It's hard to clean up the neighborhood later.
And the source thinks Bitcoin's culture is vulnerable to this right now.
That's the core warning, yeah. And this idea of the culture being ignored or even undermined, the article gives a specific example.
Ah, the Bitcoin Pizza Day incident.
Right. The source is really critical of Gemini and Mara for what they did.
Remind us what happened there, according to the article.
Well, the article claims they used Bitcoin Pizza Day, which is usually about commemorating an early real-world purchase with BTC.
The famous pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin.
Exactly. But instead of just, maybe doing some related transactions, the article says they essentially spammed a commemorative block full of what it calls junk data, specifically by stuffing it with lots and lots of OP return entries, just using that data feature heavily.
Okay, and the article's interpretation of that action.
This is key. The author sees it not as just some harmless marketing stunt, but as showing a clear disregard for the network's fundamental identity, its purpose as a system for monetary value transfer.
So using block space for non-monetary commemorative stuff, in this view, fundamentally misunderstands or dismisses Bitcoin's core goal.
That's the argument being made, yes. It's seen as disrespecting the monetary ethos.
Which then ties into the economics, right? The long-term health of the network.
Precisely. The article brings up the block subsidy the new Bitcoin created with each block, which decreases over time, halving events.
Right. It gets smaller and smaller.
So eventually, for Bitcoin to remain secure and sustainable, the network needs to rely almost entirely on transaction fees.
Fees paid by users to get their transactions included in blocks.
Exactly. And the source argues very strongly that these fees must come from real monetary use cases to provide a solid, reliable economic foundation.
But that's not what the article sees happening now.
No, the observation in the source is that this consistent, widespread monetary use just isn't what's dominating the block space. It claims blocks are sometimes half empty with very few actual financial transactions.
Yeah.
Or they're full, but they're packed with inscriptions. Speculative things like BRC20 tokens, which are built using inscriptions and other data the source deems non-monetary or low-value spam.
Okay, so it's not just a cultural critique, it's also pointing at technical decisions. It mentions Bitcoin Core specifically.
It does. Bitcoin Core is, the main software most people use to run a Bitcoin node.
And the article claims Core is part of the problem.
It argues that Bitcoin Core, maybe through certain implementations or changes, is actually facilitating this perceived decline, basically being too tolerant of this spammy activity.
That's a pretty big claim against the reference client. Does it detail which specific changes are the issue?
The source mainly asserts that Core's general approach leans towards tolerance. It contrasts it with an alternative, framing it more as a philosophical or directional choice within core development that, in the author's view, allows these low-rent tenants to take over.
Okay, so it's more about the overall stance than a specific line of code mentioned in this article.
Right. And based on that critique, the solution proposed in the source is pretty direct.
Right.
Stop running Bitcoin Core.
And switch to what instead?
The article explicitly recommends switching to Bitcoin Knots.
Bitcoin Knots. Why Knots? What's the difference, according to the source?
The source claims that Bitcoin Knots actively filters out this type of spam. It suggests Knots is maintained by developers who are, in the author's opinion, more aligned with Bitcoin's original goals.
Yeah.
Focusing on the monetary aspect and maintaining that cultural value.
Okay, so if you put all these pieces together, the red light district analogy, the critique of VCs and miners,
Yeah.
Pizza Day thing, the economic argument about fees, and this software choice between Core and Knots.
Yeah, the article makes it very clear that this isn't just some technical debate about block size or transaction types.
It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. It's presented as a fundamental discussion about the culture and the ultimate destiny of Bitcoin.
It feels like a real warning sign being put up.
It's definitely a stark warning. The fear expressed is that if the blockchain becomes primarily just a platform for, low-value data storage or purely speculative assets dressed up as tokens.
Then it's like that city council analogy you mentioned earlier.
Exactly, like a city allowing short-sighted, maybe undesirable businesses the vice to overtake the zoning space that was meant for long-term valuable development, the vision.
And there's that quote you mentioned earlier that really sums it up.
Yeah, what's fascinating is how concisely the source puts it. The warning is crystal clear. What fills the blocks today shapes what Bitcoin will become tomorrow.
The activity defines the network's future character.
That's the essence of the argument.
So if someone reads this article, or hears our discussion of it, and finds themselves agreeing with its perspective, what actions does the source suggest they take, sticking only to what the article recommends?
Okay, based only on this source material, it gives a few clear pointers for the listener, for you. First, it suggests considering stopping the use of Bitcoin Core.
And migrating to Bitcoin knots.
Right, because the source claims Knots does a better job filtering spam and aligns more with those original monetary goals.
Okay, what else?
Second, it urges users to actively make real monetary transactions on the main Bitcoin blockchain using actual BTC.
And it specifically calls out not doing something.
Yes, it explicitly says not to rely primarily on things like wrapped assets or derivatives living on other chains or layers, arguing those don't contribute directly to the on-chain fee market needed for long-term security in the way the author believes is essential.
Makes sense within their argument. And the third action.
The third is about education. The source encourages people to talk to others in the Bitcoin space about what it terms cultural hygiene.
Cultural hygiene,
Meaning explaining why these technical choices and what type of activity fills the blocks are actually really important because, according to the source, they directly shape future incentives and ultimately determine the network's long-term purpose and success as money.
So wrapping this up, what does all this really mean? This article, Bitcoin's Red Light District Future, it's certainly provocative.
It definitely presents a strong, critical argument. It forces you, the listener, to look past just the price sticker or whether blocks are technically full. It demands you think about the character of the activity happening on the network.
Yeah, it really highlights this core concern, this fear that the current trend, what it sees as a dominance of speculative data, inscriptions, over genuine money transfer, could fundamentally change Bitcoin's path.
Potentially steering it away from its intended destination as this decentralized, sound monetary system.
So if we take the article's premise seriously, that what fills the blocks today really does shape what Bitcoin becomes tomorrow, it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it?
It does.
What responsibility do individual users, developers, miners, what responsibility do you have in actively trying to maintain or participate in the original intended purpose, or let's say the culture, of a decentralized network like Bitcoin, especially when these new, maybe conflicting uses start popping up and gaining traction?
That's a heavy question about stewardship in a leaderless system.
Definitely something for you to mull over.